Jorge, primo, how would you describe the relationship between your mother, Lucy Solis Luna, and my father, Jose Luis Solis, who are both in heaven right now?
I think about some of the stories that she shared when they were younger. And it seemed like they had a very close relationship, of course, because they were pretty close to each other in age. So some of the stories that I remember specifically were, I think, just the closeness that they had with each other in terms of humor. I remember my mom saying one time that she wanted some of my Tío Joe's soda. It was in a bottle, and he really didn't want to share with her. So I don't know if he either spit in it or did something like that. And then he said, "Do you want some?" And she drank it anyway. So that was kind of the relationship that they had. But it's something that kind of stayed with me. And I'm sure that was just one example of how close they were.
When you think about their early days growing up, are there certain stories that your mom would share with you about growing up with so many siblings?
Yeah, I remember her telling me, I guess some of the things that she remembered were maybe some of the nicknames, that they had for each other. And my mom was at the time thin, and so I think she got a little bit of flack for that. And even though it was a positive thing, I think sometimes some of those memories were just of those names that they had for each other, and some of the other family dynamics that played out. I know one time she told me about Tío René coming in late, and our abuelito was not happy about it, and I just remember her saying that she remembers him flying across the living room, and I don't know if he remembers that, but she remembers that. So along with the good times, there were those memories that stood out, and some of the things that she shared with me. And again, it was part of being a big family.
When I have been talking to family members, they will openly discuss how poor our Solis family members were. What stories do you recall about their humble beginning?
Right. I think it was the thing that I remember most was, again, the fact that there was not a big house that they lived in, and the fact that there was no indoor plumbing. So the outhouse was somewhere that was memorable for my mom, in the sense that she was always fearful of going out there. And sometimes I think she would take, our Tia Beba with her to the bathroom. And from what I remember, she said, there were tarantulas were a common thing in the area. So it wasn't uncommon to come across a tarantula. So that, added with the fact that, she was using an outhouse, were, again, to me, examples of, roughing it out, a lot more than what we're used to. And some of us can't even imagine that type of living situation. But for them, it was common, and they just did what they had to do to get through those difficult situations.
How do you think that humble upbringing influenced your mother's giving, philanthropy, and social work down the road?
Yeah, I think it had a lot to do with it. I think there was always a reminder of her roots, and my mom, just like your father and the rest of our tios and tias, were all very successful in their own right. But I think for my mom, just like her siblings, there was that notion of giving back, of remembering, hey, you know what? I know what it's like to be without. And so there was, I think, this immense gratitude with their success, and there was always that notion of giving back in some capacity.
Super. How would you describe the pilgrimage that many of our uncles and aunts made from Laredo to San Antonio? So my father eventually moved here in the mid-90s, but your mom had been here starting when?
Yeah. So my mom, after she married my dad, and they met in high school at Martin High School, my dad was in the service. In fact, he was it was during the Vietnam War, but he was stationed in Germany. So when I was born back in 1966, he didn't technically lay his eyes on me till I was 6 months old. And so at the time, I don't remember if they were already here in San Antonio or in Austin, but somehow we made our way to San Antonio pretty early on. I was born in Laredo, but spent the majority of my childhood in San Antonio. And so yeah, I don't know the specifics of what brought us to San Antonio, but I was born in Laredo, and then within 6 months I was in San Antonio and have been here since.
Jorge, what memories do you have of our grandmother, Aurora Solis? And I don't know if you had a chance to ever interact with our grandfather.
I did. Very, very little. I remember him coming to our house. I must have been maybe 4 years old. And so the only thing I recall is his cowboy hat, because it was turned upside down one time in our living room, and it had the logo of the cowboy hat right in the middle of the hat, but it was like fancy. It was like a plastic over the logo, and I remember kind of playing with it. And so I have that memory. And then the only other memory I have is when he passed, and I remember the family going to the house, and I remember my mom and others crying. And again, it's just a real faint memory, but that's what I recall. And as far as our grandmother, I do have more memories of her. I remember one time at her house, she lived off of Starcrest, which at that time was out in the boonies, and now it's populated. And I remember it snowed that particular year, and she was being real loving to her grandchildren, and she made us raspas or snow cones with the snow from the yard, and she put some flavoring on it, and we started eating it. And I don't know how my mom found out about it later, but she kind of scolded my grandmother and said, you don't do that. It's snow from God knows where, and you're grabbing it from the ground, and that's not how you make raspas. But I ate it and I survived. So, but I do have that memory that I think was pretty funny. And then just tortillas being made by her at different times, and then my mom being one of her caregivers as she got ill, and the challenges of my mom at that time. Providing care for her mom was something that kind of stayed with me because it was not easy.
What kind of relationship did our grandmother Aurora Solis have with your mom? Were the two of them very sympathetic, or?
I think in some ways growing up, the way my mom described our grandmother was that she kind of didn't want her in the kitchen. I think my mom at times regretted that because my mom would always say, I'm not the best cook, but your grandmother always pushed me out of the way. Now, I don't know, again, the story behind that, but I do remember that. And then as the years went by, I think there was a simplicity to our grandmother, a nice simplicity. But I think in some ways, my mom growing up was naive in many ways. And so she kind of had to find out what might have been shared with her earlier, as a young person, that was kind of maybe not shared with her and kept her sort of in the dark. So,
super. Jorge, what are your early recollections of my father, maybe my mother, over the years?
Mm-hmm. I remember going to some parties in Laredo at their house. I remember my Tío Joe as being successful, even from back in the day. I just remember him being so intelligent, and I saw that with my own eyes. And of course, your mom was always beautiful and so stylish and so elegant. To this day, she remains like that. But I just remember them, being who they were in their own distinct way. I saw my Tío Joe as somebody successful, somebody intelligent. My Tia Laura, beautiful physically, also very intelligent as well. And yeah, that's kind of what I recall from them looking back over the years, especially early on.
Fascinating. In terms of the siblings, the brothers, and we'll leave Tia Beba out and your mom, mm-hmm. How do you think the siblings interacted? Do you think there were like certain brothers that really clicked together, and why?
Yeah, I the only thing I can recall is, I guess, again, family get-togethers back in the 70s, maybe early 80s, but more mid-70s when a lot of us primos would get together during these family gatherings. And I just remember, my tios sitting, drinking beer, talking about work or education. I think of my Tio Pancho, sort of being, the oldest during that time outside of my Tia Sofia, kind of being almost like another father figure in some way with the other siblings. I think of my Tio Neto as a jokester, somebody who just had this little smirk in his eye, this little twinkle in his eye. I think of my Tio Raul as being just more of the quiet one, just very, very polite, but more on the quiet side. And then, I've mentioned, of course, my Tio Joe and my Tio Rene, also just sort of like the young one out of the group. And so I think if there was anything, maybe the connection between Tio Rene and Tio Joe was maybe a little bit closer because of their age, whereas the other three were a little bit older. But always, I picture them, just having a good time, joking around, drinking beer, and just having, the respect that they had for each other and for their families.
Jorge, a few minutes ago, I told you about a story that Mr. Enrique Ramon told me, and he said, "Oh, Joe, I remember your grandmother, Aurora Solis, and she used to comb her hair the way you comb your hair, and she had the salt and pepper that you have in your mustache." And my question to you is there a common denominator in terms of personality traits or values that you have seen in your lifetime on our Solis side?
Yeah, I think one thing that I've learned from seeing our family and being involved in the way that we've been involved as nieces and nephews is just the respect for family, for traditions, the importance of working hard, of studying, of getting an education. That's what I've learned from our tios and tias. There's just a lot of value put in that in terms of just working to be successful, not for anybody outside of your family, but just to provide and to be everything you can be. And especially from your dad, my Tio Joe, there was just so much respect I had for him for being an example of what you can do when you set your mind to it and when you are willing to put in the work. So,
yeah, when I contemplate the fact that he received a master's in aerospace engineering at Texas A&M in 1970 or 69 when I was born, there were no computers back then. I mean, maybe there were these huge super processing machines, but I think to myself, you had to be pretty darn smart to survive that kind of environment because you had to know these problems.
Right. No, absolutely. And speaking of my Tio Joe's intelligence, I want to share a memory with you because I've been thinking about it. So there was, and I can't tell you what year it was, but it was a while back when my mom lived in a condominium, and my Tio Joe was there. I don't know what the gathering was. But long story short, the TV was on and we were watching Jeopardy. I never watched Jeopardy that often. I'm sitting there with my Tio Joe watching Jeopardy and he's rattling off all the answers correctly. And I'm like, to this day, I've never sat with anybody who could rattle off the answers as quickly and as correctly as he did that one night, I guess it was. And it just stayed with me. I was like, oh my God, he is so smart.
I remember him doing crossword puzzles, or was it crossword puzzles crossword puzzles, and you have to be so intelligent to understand what these two words mean that are trying to encourage you to find out what this word or this block with 3 letters is, and you're just like, how do you know all that stuff? I was mystified.
No, that's exactly what I was experiencing that time when I sat with him watching Jeopardy. I was like, it's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. And it was, and you know what I loved about it, it was not done in a boastful way. He was just humbly just giving out the answers correctly. And I didn't say anything. I was just like speechless. But it stayed with me, and it had to have been, I don't know, 30 years ago or longer. I don't know. It's been a long time. Or I don't know how long it's been on the air, but it's been a long time.
It is a fascinating facet that when my father passed away, his brain power was still at it. I remember being at University Hospital and I was having a conversation with a medical and nursing professional, and I was telling them about this one friend that I knew that X, Y, and Z happened. And my father is there, literally just, you were thinking he was asleep. And then he blurted out, "Oh, is it Steve Walker?" He was literally listening. And Steve Walker passed away 5 years ago.
Wow.
And so my question to you, Jorge, in reference to this is that, if I'm not mistaken, I think your mother dealt with the challenges of Alzheimer's, dementia?
Yes.
And there were other family members, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
What percentage of our family members had to go through that dreadful medical condition versus members who were not? And do you ever contemplate that, like for us, since we're in our 50s?
Yeah. I've thought about it. I know my mom experienced that, and I know Tio Raul also experienced that because he was on hospice with our company, so I know he went through that. And I don't give it too much thought, only because within my own immediate family, both my parents had Parkinson's, and so to me that's an illness that I think of more often than the Alzheimer's, only because it was my parents. As a result, I've chosen not to delve deeper into what are the chances of me getting Parkinson's. My dad had Parkinson's even younger than the age that I'm currently. He'd had it since he was in his early 50s. And then my mom got it, hers was a late onset. But as of right now, I know I don't have it. I've checked on it. And I just will live life, to the best of my ability and stay as healthy as I can. But that's kind of how I deal with that in terms of thinking about possible future illness.
Jorge, in one of our message threads, my mom refers to all of the primos as my father's children, right? And I never really understood that until his passing, that many of our primos saw him as either a connection to their parents or a representative of that generation. For you, what was your connection to my father, and like what did you experience when you were communicating with him via text? Because that was something brand new. Only in terms of technology, that's only like 4 or 5 years old.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think again, when you asked me earlier about the connection between my mom and your dad, I mean, that extended into later years, as your dad had his jewelry business and you guys worked it. Of course, my mom was also helping you with that business. So Tio Joe was always sort of in view, because he was a part of that. And Tio Joe was also so generous with my mom, on her birthday. Every birthday, he would send her like $250, just like that. And so she would always say, "I'm waiting for my Tio Joe's check. My birthday's coming up." And sure enough, it always would land, and I always thought about that because it was so generous. And so, getting back to, the nieces and nephews being like an extended children to him, I don't know what it was. I mean, I can talk about my connection, and again, my mom and your dad were very close. But I think it was something very consistent about your dad. It was just, you just knew Tio Joe was somebody special because he was there. And it was maybe his humbleness, maybe it was his intelligence, it was his travels, it was his ability to share stories, it was his attention to detail when it came to talking about family. But there were so many positive aspects to his being that was just attractive. And to this day, even up until last year, visiting him and your mom at their place at the craft mill or craft store was just incredible. And Isabel and I, one of the last times that we saw him there, in fact, it was probably the last time we saw him there, we rode our Vespas over there. And so we had our helmets with us, and he was like, "Oh, you guys came on your bikes?" And I said, "Yeah." And so him and your mom came out to the parking lot, and he took a picture, and then he sends it out to the family via text. He goes, look what these guys came in, and I just thought it was just, it was just so cool. It was just something very small, and yet something very big at the same time. There was a certain hipness that he had, with his travels and his stories, and his knowledge of so many different areas. So I don't know how else to say it, but he was truly special.
Thank you. A few moments ago, you made reference to my father sharing family stories on the text thread. Right now in 2025, are there any stories that come to mind like, oh, you know what, I hadn't thought about that story? Or here's another story that really symbolizes maybe his connection with Tio Neto. Anything come to mind?
I think there's not a particular thing that comes to mind, but I think it was just the beauty of him sharing. And a lot of times with text, because of my work, I sometimes don't always spend a lot of time on them. I would like to, but sometimes with the multiple texts that I get from work, I have to address those. But it was more about his love for his family, the generations that follow, the generations that came before him, the ability to put that into words and to pictures, to me stood out. So it wasn't anything specific, but it was the whole thing. The fact that he would take the time to do that made me look at my life and say, I want to do the same thing for my children and their children. And so that's kind of what he instilled in me by sharing those stories.
I was always amazed over the years about how certain Solis family members had this ability to continuously laugh about everything, whether it was Tio Pancho or Tio Neto or your mom. Like your mom's sense of humor at times would be like, where did that come from?
Right.
Where do you think that originated from?
Yeah, I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. I mean, if I had to pinpoint something, I don't know. But I think it goes back again to being without, working hard to make something of yourself, and then being just so grateful, for your life, and being able to look back and to say, we didn't have a lot growing up, but our parents instilled in us the ability to work hard and to be generous and to give back. And so I think if you look at that as a whole, there is a sense of joy to experience life from every angle, and to have the gratitude, which I think they all did. And in the end, just to be grateful to be a part of this world. I really don't know, but that's a great question. I wish I had a better answer, but I just sensed that there was an overall gratitude for what they'd been through as children, for being taught the right way, even if it was the hard way, to make something of yourself, and then to recognize the fruits of your labor and to look back with gratitude for everything that had been shared with them and instilled in them many years before.
Now, the flip side of that, Jorge, would be many of our tios and tias had very strong personalities. I mean, they were not pushovers.
Right.
My next question has to do with the relationship between your mother and Tio Pancho.
Mm-hmm.
And they both had very strong wills and and strong beliefs. Do you recall anything about their connection? Because they both lived here in San Antonio.
Yeah. No, I think they butted heads often. I do. Again, I don't know the specifics, but I can say they probably did butt heads. I think there was something about him being the oldest, and then her just being, outspoken as she was. I don't think she was always that way, but I think over time, she developed, a tough exterior when she needed to be. And then she could be the most generous, loving person at any given moment. But I think there was probably some resentment maybe over the years of maybe feeling like she was bossed around. And I will tell you one thing, as we talk about our tios and tias, what I admire most about them is the fact that their lives were not perfect. They were not perfect in any sense of the word. And I say that respectfully. Mm-hmm. But my mom made mistakes along the way. Your dad made mistakes. Mm-hmm. And I say that again with humbleness and with much respect. But to me, that is a reflection of how, despite our shortcomings and the mistakes that we all make, there is still the goodness in our hearts to do so much good despite our detours and our shortcomings. And so to me, it gives hope to all of us that regardless of circumstances and some wrong turns along the way, there is still the ability to do good and make something out of maybe a bad situation.
Yeah.
And so that stays with me. And yeah.
And that's such a great piece of introspection, because they never held themselves out to be saints or to be perfect. And there was, now that, I mean, you've now jogged my memory in about our history, right? And how these detours happen. But there was like a humbleness where everyone said, we'll take you back.
Yes.
We're going to forgive.
Absolutely.
We're going to maybe understand that maybe at this phase in your life, these decisions were made. Yeah. And that really says a lot, because no one was ever scorned.
Never. Not even my father, who had really done some bad damage to my mom, emotionally. I never saw Tio Rene or Tio Neto turn their back and say, I'm not going to deal with, him because he was mean to my sister. Never. And the same can be said for all of our tios and tias. Like you said, there was never that form of betrayal or that you just screwed up so badly that we just can't, work beyond this. It was always, adjustments were made according to what was going on in their lives. And that's the right way to handle it. Nobody knows the full story. So it's easy to be judgmental. It's harder to not be judgmental. And yet that's how they handle those conflicts, those detours, like you mentioned. And I respect that so much. Yeah.
Jorge, you've been in the hospice, in the professional hospice industry segment for the past 8 years. When you have observed our family members transitioning from this earth to other places, is there anything that stands out to you as a hospice professional about how our relatives have left? And I'm referring to from our abuelitos to the uncles and cousins. Would you say, like, one thing that I've noticed within our tribe is this reaction to either someone passing away, or this is how death was viewed?
Well, I do know that they were supportive always. If there was somebody ill, if there was somebody in the hospital, I could count on Tio Pancho being there. When my kids were born, he was there. Who does that? And the same goes for those moments of illness. There was that support, the presence of somebody there. When my mom was ill and on hospice, I was constantly keeping your dad and our Tio Rene informed every step of the way. And it was important for me to do that because I just knew that their support was always there. And I had to make some very challenging decisions as my mom's medical power of attorney when things got really bad. And the first person I called was my Tio Joe and my Tio Rene. And they were in agreement. And it was a tearful conversation. It really was, because I basically pulled my mom off of all her meds when it got to a point where it's like, you know what? I'm not going to prolong this for my own selfishness. I have to make a decision. And I called them. Outside of calling my immediate family, I called my two tios. And they were with me along the journey. And of course, when she did pass, first call I made was to my wife and my sister and my Tio Rene and my Tio Joe. The same night, within an hour that she had passed, they were already aware that she had passed. And they were very supportive, very tearful, of course, but very supportive. So I don't know how to put it into other words other than they were there. And I respected their presence. And to this day, I will never forget that.
Super. Jorge, in reference to the relationship between Tia Beba and your mother, and then the next question would be my father within that mix.
Yeah.
So you have two sisters and my father.
Yeah.
What kind of dynamic went on between the two sisters and then the trio?
Yeah. I don't think either one had a problem with Tio Joe. The problem was probably between my Tia Beba and my mom, for sure, for sure. I think that stemmed from way back when they were kids. And again, I don't know all the specifics, but surely there was something there. And I think it existed even well into their later years. I think there may have been moments when things were more peaceful, but going back to what I discussed earlier, again, certain things were happening, certain challenges emotionally were happening at a certain time for both my mom and Tia Veva, especially in the form of relationships with marriage and so forth. So that didn't help. But I think some of those things just lasted over the years. And it didn't take away from my Tia Veva's generosity and love towards me and even towards my mom. But I think there was sort of a backstory that just kind of stayed there and lingered for many, many years. I think eventually it was put to rest, but not for a long, long time.
So I get the impression, unless I'm wrong, that here in San Antonio, where they both resided, maybe they didn't go and have lunch together all the time,
Right.
or they weren't great buddies. So there was like something there.
Of course, yes. Yeah. And it was still manageable. I just think that, like you say, they weren't going to be the best of friends, even as sisters. I think they would communicate as needed and they would still be supportive of each other. But it was maybe not the ideal sister-sister relationship where they're just like the best of friends. I don't think that ever existed. But I think there was a mutual respect. I think they would still be there in times of need. But I think there was just some things that just never fully went away.
So so my father had to be a true ambassador working with the two of them.
Absolutely. And I don't know, how many times that came into play, but I'm sure it did. I don't think it was, I'm sure there was probably back talk about each one to your dad and him being sort of the peacemaker. I couldn't give you the specifics, but I'm sure I could see that happening. Yeah.
That makes me think about a story that our prima Cindy Solis Alejos told me about your mother. In fact, I just remembered it right now. And it turns out that your mother had asked Cindy to go to some department store to make a payment and then to pick this up and to pick that up. And this was going on an ongoing basis. Then my father stepped in and said, to your mom, you got to stop doing that because, she has a full-time job. But Cindy, out of respect for your mom, would do that.
Yes.
And I thought, what an interesting dynamic that you have a grown adult telling another grown adult, hey, you know what?
Yeah.
But it goes back to that family dynamic, right?
Right. Yes, absolutely. And my mom, she would do that. She would do that up until the very end. And I, as a son, had to, put my foot down respectfully, and it took a lot of courage because, again, her personality could be challenging, and so I'm not surprised. And even to this day, I remember as she was getting more ill, if she got a craving for something, specifically Pizza Hut pizza. She would tell you right there, I want a pizza, go get me a pizza. And she did that to your dad even towards the end. And of course, he was so nice. He went and got her pizza. And I remember a particular day when she was already on hospice and she wanted pizza. And I just couldn't do it at the time. I had something going on. it was time constraint. And I said, Mom, I can't do that. I can't get you pizza right now. And she was pissed, I mean, she was mad, and she said, you better leave. And she told me in Spanish, you better leave before I really lose it. I was like, okay, I'll get going then. And so, but it was just, one of those things, but yeah, so yeah, that's kind of the stuff that we dealt with on a regular basis.
How did your mother's charitable social work influence you?
Big time. I mean, I was in the corporate world for 17 years, and I, initially it was good, and then towards the last couple of years, I just thought, I can't do this the rest of my life. And I looked at promotions, and I was able to get my degree in business management, but her work as a social worker was inspiring. She was a phenomenal social worker. She made miracles happen that just can't even be explained because of her persistence. She didn't take no from anybody. So when she was advocating for one of her clients, you better do more than just say no. You better, So I don't know how else to explain it, but she was just a rhino when it came to that stuff. She just pushed forward. So when I was at USAA, I started working with a mentoring program. So I started working with an at-risk student. on my day off. And this particular young man was in the 4th grade, and I stayed with him all the way through high school. On my day off, I spent an hour with him, and this was before I was a social worker. But because of that, and my mom's work, I decided to change careers. I left, USA after 17 years, and I went and got my master's in social work. And I ended up working for the same company that my mom worked for. And it just so happened, and I almost didn't get hired because of that, but somehow somebody pushed it through and I was able to get started with them. But the reality is we had the same manager for a moment, for a brief time. I was at a particular clinic, she was at another clinic, and we worked for the same boss. Well, my mom, when she was getting closer to retirement, she told me, she said, George, I'm going to retire because I want you to become the manager of this department. And I said, okay. And that was that. I was like, it's just like, it's something my mom would say, right? And I said, okay. And she retired, as she said she would. And lo and behold, I became the manager of that same department.
Wow.
Yeah.
She became your advocate.
Your
career advocate.
And so I ended up going to the same office where she worked, and I became a supervisor there. And so more than once, I had a patient come in and said, Luna? And I said, yeah. Yo conocí a alguien que se llamaba Luz Luna. I was like, yeah, I know her. And so there was a connection there. So the people at Methodist Healthcare Ministries knew that I was her son. And I, I would always say to them, I'm not my mom, okay? I can try to be a really good social worker and I think I'm all right. I said, but I could never be my mom. I said, she was phenomenal. And maybe I sold myself short by saying that, but I really understood the impact that she had on her clients' lives. And I thought, even on my best day, I can't do it. But it was something to shoot towards. And to this day, I still use that as the goal.
Where do you think that determination, let's face it, she was stubborn in terms of achieving goals. Here's my objective. Here's a person in need. Where did that persistence come from?
I don't know. Maybe it was instilled early on. Maybe it was just some of the hardships that she went through. I think there was a time where, again, because of her maybe being a little bit more introverted, which I know is hard to believe, she saw some things that she wasn't okay with. And so I think some of the problems that she had in the marriage with my dad allowed her to speak up and say, you know what, no more. And I remember that. And I will tell you something when you asked me about our abuelita.
Yeah.
So when my mom was going through her divorce with my dad, this was, maybe it was a separation. This was back in maybe the late 70s, early 80s. So the song I Will Survive by Gloria Gaynor was popular.
Yeah.
Well, that became my mom's anthem, right? Because she had separated from my dad. And of course, you listen to the lyrics, I Will Survive. It's like all about moving forward, saying goodbye to your ex or whatever. So she had the 45 record of that song, and she played it over and over and over again. And so at that time, she was the caregiver for our abuelita. And so our abuelita told her one time, isn't there any other song that you listen to? Because back then you had to manually change the record. And so I remember doing that over and over again. And I could recite that song from beginning to end because that's all she played until it was instilled in her, I can do this. And as a result, after that divorce, she went on back to school, got her degree in her 50s. And of course, Tio Joe and Tio Rene celebrated that accomplishment with her. And that inspired me also to finish my degree, which I was taking forever to do. And so I think that was part of it, just the fact that maybe she had been selling herself short, and who knows? I don't know when the switch was flipped, but it was. And from then on, there was no looking back.
Are there any interesting habits, quirks, or unique experiences that you had with our many tios and tias in the Solis circles, or was there something like, you know what, when this person did this, I was like, whoa, I didn't know you could do this, or you had this talent. Did anything come to mind?
I think it was just, we've mentioned already before the sense of humor, the lightness about it. I think of my tío Neto as being one of those, also one of the big influences from our tíos, mainly because we had golf in common. We played a lot of golf. And so he was always very supportive and loved to play golf with me. He just thought I had the best golf swing, and he just loved to play golf with me.
I completely forgot about that.
Yeah.
You were a big golfer, and I
Yeah.
remember one time, I think I was either with you and Tío Neto. We were down in South Texas somewhere. I don't know, maybe it was
Yeah, it's
somewhere close to Laredo, and I remember thinking, how do these guys like doing this in the hot sun? Which leads me to my question about your interaction with Tío Neto being out on the golf course. What jokes, stories, memories do you have about that?
Yeah, there's many. There's so many. There's so many. I could talk to you a long time about those. One of them is Tío Neto just eating so fast. He just had a tendency to eat fast, like he was in a race. And so if we were sitting down eating breakfast before going to tee off, he just would just eat quickly. I have that same tendency. I eat fast, even when I don't need to. I just eat fast. So maybe that's something I picked up along the way. And I do remember one time going out to, I think it was Brackenridge Golf Course, with Tío René and Tío Neto. And Tío Neto had either a red shirt and yellow shorts or vice versa. And I remember Tío René telling him, God, you look like ketchup and mustard. What is up with that outfit? Anyway, and it was just funny. And again, and their sense of humor, and then their ability to just stand up for the right stuff. And one time when we were playing golf, Tío Neto saw these little boys kind of throwing rocks at squirrels. They just kind of thought it was funny, right? I don't know how they got on the golf course, but or they were with a slingshot. They were trying to hurt squirrels, and he just got on them and said, "What are you doing? Get out of here! You don't do that!" And they ran. And I was like, "Okay, Tío Neto." It was just, again, sense of humor, but if there was an injustice, if there was something that didn't sit right, all of them would speak up. And that was something that I learned. It was just a small little example, but it was something that stayed with me.
That must have been quite an experience, because at that point you were, 15, 16?
Yeah.
Golfing out, and because you're talking about being out there for hours with them.
Really,
I'm sure you learn a lot about people.
I did. And at that time when I was in high school, I played varsity golf all 4 years in high school, and I played golf with my dad on Sunday. So the only day that I did not play golf was Saturday. So I was playing 6 days a week for several years, and so that was a big part of my life.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
What did your mom say about all that golfing? Did she think, what is he up to? What is he doing all this?
She knew about it. She was supportive. My dad was extremely supportive since he was a golfer as well. But it was a good connection that I had, obviously, with my tío René, my tío Joe, and my dad. Tío René came into the picture a little bit later. He didn't pick up on golf right away. It was a little bit later. But it was something that we had in common, and it was just... you learn a lot about people, like you say. There's a lot of conversations that go on in those 4.5 hours of playing golf. So it was an amazing opportunity to see, my dad and my tíos from a different perspective altogether.
Jorge, when you look at the landscape of our primos, first generation, second generation, and now we have children and grandchildren and so forth. When you look at this landscape, do you say, you know what? When I see Cindy Alejos, or when I see Raul Jr., here are some Solis characteristics that are so obvious, either looks, personality traits. Does anything come to mind in 2025?
So what comes to mind is not so much where we are now, but when I see Cindy and Raulito or Javier or Juanito, and I still call him Juanito, it's just a connection to our childhood, I know where they are now as adults and as parents and grandparents, but when I get together with them, there's going to be a reference to our childhood, always. It's a flashback. And I just think that is a direct result of our tios and tias being who they were and instilling us the importance of family and the memories, that we had. So even today, even when I see my son Phil and Juan's son Paco, they play golf together at times. And Paco stood in Phil's wedding. And so there's a connection that will always be there. But I still can't help but think of memories of our childhood whenever I see them. In 2025, I just remember what we've been through as children growing up with our parents. It's just something that it's always there. Even if it's not mentioned, in my mind it's there. I don't know how they feel, but it's there. And I stood in Cindy's wedding, and so we're intertwined. We always will be, which I'm grateful for.
When you look back, are you aware or do you recall any major traumatic event that happened within our family that you could say, whoa, this was a tipping point for many family members, and this was the reaction to this happening? And this could be anything from our tios going into the military, or, as you said, divorces happening within the family. Are there any things that you now look back and say, you know what, that was a real tipping point?
I think there were several, if I really think long and hard about it. But the divorces, the deaths, they all had, a certain sadness to them, right? They were traumatic. And yet, there was that perseverance of our family. So even despite the passing and the divorces and those relationships that ended, it was still survivable. I can't say that for every family out there. Tipping point, yes, for lots of families. For ours, on the Solis side, I don't know if there was ever any tipping point. There was some hard times, but it was as if, things were going to work out some way, somehow.
Yeah.
And maybe it took some years for some of those things to be mended, but they still worked out some way, somehow. And that's something that has always stayed with me, because you can't say that for every family out there. And it's not anybody's fault. But this family was always different. There was always something positive about it. When I look at my paternal side of the family, I can't say that. There was like tipping points, and it was like, it's still traumatic even thinking about it today. But I can't say that about the Solis side of the family. I can say, yes, there were some rocky things happening along the way. There were mistakes made along the way. There were losses. And yet, there's still a sense of humor. There's still a lightness about that. And today, I can look back and still say, yeah, some things were traumatic, but we're still here. We're still connected.
And that makes me think about my own personal journey with my Solis tios when we moved to San Antonio after my parents got divorced in 81. There was a period of time when I really did not have a lot of contact with the primos or the uncles. Yeah. And then in the mid 80s to the late 80s, I started reconnecting with my tios, Tio Pancho, and when I spoke about these family experiences at my father's 80th birthday, which in many ways I look back now and I was thinking, that was kind of a eulogy. It was 2,700 words that I memorized, and I talked about his life, and I talked about all of the uncles and in my own personal experiences. They were very limited, but they were such gifts.
Yeah.
And I think to myself that, wow, they've given us gifts over the years.
Yeah, for sure. I agree 100%.
Now, in reference to your work with hospice, and a few moments ago, prior to this interview's starting, you talked about writing a book. What have been some of the big lessons that you have taken away working in hospice in the past 8 years, and how it's connected to our family and things you've learned from our side and things you've learned on your side in managing your own family now that you have grandchildren?
Right. Well, one thing I've learned is everybody has a story. Everyone has a story. And and despite, some detours and things of that nature, in the end, it always works out the way it's supposed to work out. Mistakes, successes, failures, good times, bad times, and everything in between. I don't think there's any accidents. I don't think there's any like, wow, that just shouldn't have happened. It was meant to happen, in some cosmic way, it was meant to happen the way it did. And so as I work with those who truly are on their last chapter of life, are there regrets? Maybe, but there's more about valuing what's important at that point. If things were overlooked at one time because of priorities being different, they're now a little bit more tangible in the sense that, like, I have a timeline here. Like, I truly know that my time is limited here. I mean, we all know that. I mean, can't foretell when we're going to leave this world. But when someone's on hospice, there is a recognition that I'm being faced with my own mortality now. And in some ways, that's not always a curse. It's a blessing to say, now I can truly, maybe it's not too late to truly recognize and make some of these things meaningful, and then there can be healing. And so, bringing it back to the family, I think, again, it's about being able to recognize the shortness of all of our lives. The duration is short. And so it's making every moment count. And I'm not going to give you all the cliches that are out there, but it's just being able to recognize that, all of us have a life well lived. And hopefully we can recognize that as early as we can. And so that we're not doing it when we're really towards the last chapter of our lives.
So as a result of your work, would you say one goal that I personally have in reference to hospice, living well, teaching people, would you say there's a future goal that you have? You've talked about writing a book. Mm-hmm. Do you see yourself maybe doing personal counseling? Let's say at some point you decide to retire from a professional position you're at. What do you foresee your mission being based on your mother's work and your work?
Yeah. I just want to be able to leave a legacy, and right now that is with my children, who are adults already, but, just being able to see them, begin their families, to sort of be that little source of wisdom, and I say that again humbly because I'm always learning, and I'm still learning to this day. I think I'm more aware of my learning than I ever have been in my life. But I think for me, my priority is just, enjoy the simpler things in life. Don't get caught up with the things that can take away from being with my family, if that's what's called. To be able to put things down and say, you know what, that can wait. If I'm seeing one of my, my grandson's basketball game, I'm in the moment. It's mindfulness. That's where I'm at. And gratitude, to be able to have an opportunity like that. I'm really savoring those moments now more than ever before. And I just want to be able to have somebody look back on my life and said, that's what Jorge stood for. That's who he was, and he wasn't perfect. Trust me, I would be the last person to say that. But despite that, there are memories that we can draw on. Silly things he said, silly things he did. And so now there's less of what I want to look like and more about just being who I really am. And it's hard. It's been a lifetime, and I'm still working on it today. But I'm really trying to say, who cares? This is who I am. Yeah. And those who truly love me and care about me will accept me just as I am.
Jorge, I have two more questions, and thank you again for participating in this project. The first one would be the religious upbringing of our parents, the Catholicism, and maybe branches. How important was religion and Catholicism to our Solis family members? And the second question I have for you is, what message would you have to my children and grandchildren, future grandchildren, there's no grandchildren now, about my father and that legacy?
Mm-hmm. In terms of the spirituality, I mean, that was a big part of my mom's life. And I have something very much in common with Tio Joe in terms of the spirituality part, and I'll explain that here in just a bit. So, in terms of my mom's spirituality, she had a turning point. She attended a church retreat called a Cursillo. And this was back in, I want to say it was 82, when she lived at Cursillo. When she came back, I was like, who are you? And she was, I thought, a spiritual person to begin with. But when she came out of that retreat, she was a whole new being. And then later she ended up going to the Holy Land, and again, that was a transformation that was unbelievable. And so I think that was when her faith journey began. But when she lived that Cursillo weekend, a few months later, she's like, there's a young adult Cursillo I want you to go to. And I kind of thought, I was kind of soul searching. This was back in 1983, so I was a senior in high school. And I was kind of reading positive thinking books. I was kind of working on my self-esteem issues. And so I was open to the idea. I had no idea what that was. I didn't know anybody at the retreat. So I by faith, I said, you know what? I can see the effect it had on my mom. I'm open to it. And I went to it. And it was transformative for me too, in a very spiritual way. And I started changing my priorities just as I was going into my senior year in high school, when I was faced with lots of different temptations. I was just viewing things very differently. I was no saint, so to speak, but I was looking at things from a spiritual perspective, and it helped me to be a little bit more mature with my decision making. And so I ended up meeting Isabel through the Cursillo because we had a community of young adults, and we met and later started dating, and we started dating in 87 and got married in 1990, and I married one of the most Catholic families you could ever marry into, and I'm grateful for that to this day. I'm still grateful now, almost 35 years later. However, the connection with Tio Joe and the Cursillo is that my mom invited him to a Cursillo. I don't remember what year it was. And he said yes, and he went. And I know he got a lot out of it. I don't know how much he spoke of it, because my Tio Joe was a good man to begin with. I just think that this helped him deepen his faith to some extent. But I do remember him going to that retreat, and there was a team member who had presented at that retreat that my Tio Joe was a part of. And this team member kind of had a checkered past. He had some problems with the law and so forth. But I remember my Tio Joe told me about him, and I knew him, who he was. I didn't know him that well, but I knew him. And he said, I talked to so-and-so, and I told him, hey, believe in yourself. He was kind of talking down about himself. And so I encouraged him to not talk down about himself, to believe in himself, and to know that he can do good. And it stayed with me, because I thought, here my Tio Joe is attending this retreat as a retreatant, and he's giving guidance and assistance to a team member who was there to do that for him. And it stayed with me. And just up until a couple of years ago. So I say that because I'm very involved with the Cursillo. As a leader, I manage what's called their School of Leaders. So I facilitate on twice a month I have a School of Leaders. And it's only for the leaders of that particular movement. But after my Tio Joe passed, I shared with them during one of our School of Leaders about my Tio Joe, and I talked about him at length, because my Tio Joe's funeral touched me tremendously, as it did with everybody that was present. But I talked about him being a cursista, and I gave that example of him giving guidance to one of the team members at that time. And again, this was many, many years ago. And so there was always that connection. We never talked about Cursillo, but he was a cursista, and I still remember that. So last year, I invited our cousin Juan to a Cursillo, and he went, and I was on that team. And I reminded Juan, I said, our Tio Joe is a cursista. He said, really? And so Juan made the Cursillo with me as a team member, and he as a candidate. And so the spirituality was instilled early on, and it carried over and continues to this day. And so he always had of all the tios and tias, only my mom and Tio Joe made the cursillo. But it was something that, well, I'll always remember, because I went to his clausura when he came out. And so it was something special.
If you don't mind me asking, Jorge, why did my father's passing affect you in a big way?
He was always so special. And I think it goes back to his relationship with my mom. I just think he was just a part, like he made my mom happy. He made my mom happy. Like, again, I mentioned the generosity and birthdays, and I would love to see my mom happy, and he was just so generous. And yes, it was a monetary gift, but it was more than that. It was the thoughtfulness, of doing something that allowed her to be happy. And so I think that was what I remembered him for.
And I like what you said earlier, that there were many times in her life when she was maybe surrounded by undependable people or people that didn't keep their word.
Yes.
And with his consistency and his generosity during those years, well, that's something you hold on to.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I never thought about it that way, but I think that's probably has a lot to do with it. I think there was, again, that consistency. And for me, it was the same thing. It was just, I knew Tio Joe was there, and he was just a good man. If you said Tio Joe, you were talking good. It didn't matter, again, and I know, your parents had experienced, marital issues for several years, and I know all the specifics of that. And yet, it didn't matter to me, as a nephew, that happened. I mean, I felt bad maybe for you and Carlos, because you guys were different, experiencing it a totally different way. But I just thought, he's a good man. And my mom would never speak badly about him either. So I just think that goes a long way for all of us.
And she was a tough customer.
Yes.
I mean, she could, I'm sure, I always had the impression that your mom could look at someone and break them down.
For sure.
Within seconds.
She could.
And know what's driving you, what's motivating you, but also what are the particular dangers I might have with you by making myself vulnerable. Because of her experiences.
Absolutely. No, she was a force to be reckoned with. Absolutely.
I wanted to share one final story with you, and this is something I didn't even know. My father, and talking about the magic of stories, and I'm so happy you love to tell stories, but about 4 years ago, I found out that my father was named by his father, Jorge Solis, because our grandfather loved Joe Louis the boxer.
Oh, wow.
So all this time, here I am, 54. When I found out I was 53 years old 2 years ago, I found out, oh my God, we're named after a black boxer who went boxing in the 30s. And this comes to mind because at University Hospital, one nurse came in and said, this man's a real fighter.
Wow.
And then it occurred to me, and I told him the story that, what, he's actually named after a boxer. We're named after a boxer.
That's pretty cool. I did not know that.
Yeah, it's not wild.
That is pretty cool.
I mean, all this time I thought we were named after some Mexican mariachi singer, but it was actually a black dude, which kind of makes me kind of cool, I guess.
Yeah, very
Well, Jorge, thank you so much for your time this Tuesday.
I appreciate it.
In January, and we look forward to creating even more stories down the road.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, Primo.
Of course.